I direct a practice in Modi'in that does comprehensive DBT for, we have 3 different programs that run. One is for adults, which is, from let's say 25 to dead. And then we run for emerging adults, which is usually, 17 to 21-ish. And then we have an adolescent program, which runs usually the bottom floor of it is 15, and that runs till about 18. And then the rest of the practice is what you would typically see in any individual therapy practice. The focus of today is how to generate treatment commitment with people who are resistant. Now, theoretically, you can use the exact same skills to some degree with adults, but in a lot of ways it could be more challenging with teens themselves. And the truth is also with treatment-resistant parents. So sometimes the teen could be somewhat willing or incredibly unwilling, but their parent is also, at the very least, ambivalent. And so that's going to be what we focus on today. And there's some technical things, and a lot of this I actually go over with any particular client or their parent, in this particular case, in our phone call. Oh, is not good enough? Better to use that?
Now it's just recording. This one's for speaking.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. Is this good? Yeah. Is this necessary? Okay. So I always begin with a parent interview, and the truth is I begin with a parent interview regardless of whether the parent thinks it's a good idea or whether the teen would be upset about it, because the truth is I really care about effectiveness and nothing else. So a person's unwillingness to do something really doesn't bear a lot of influence on whether I decide it's a good idea. If it's a bad idea, then that should decide whether I do it or not. But the idea of a person just generally being unwilling, it's actually a pretty good indicator that they might be unwilling further down the line. The parent interview has 3 primary focuses and 3 primary purposes. One is to get the perspective of an observer. Generally speaking, when you work with someone who's an adult, you don't necessarily get an outside perspective on how is this kid's behavior or their experience influencing their environment. The second one is that a teen, the truth is I'll say it how I typically do, which is that people are often dog shit at describing their own experience. Very often people can just be horrible at it. And the idea that we're going to rely on a teen's experience to be able to communicate something that they're either incapable of providing or unwilling to provide is just going to leave you with very limited information. And so the idea is to then provide a platform for their interview, right? The idea is that if I know already a lot of what they're experiencing, or at least what has gone on in their life until now, I can really focus a lot more on commitment, because oftentimes what the teen elects to do is I go over what you have discussed or what I've discussed with your parents, and then you can kind of say, hey, listen, this event happened, but maybe not exactly as they're describing, or I have a different experience of it. And so the idea is I don't necessarily take a parent's perspective at face value, but it does provide a decent platform. Now, I think that probably if you were to think about an intake, and I never call it an intake, the truth is I think that everything begins with your philosophical underpinning, and I believe that everything is a consultation. Right? When you begin a treatment, we're doing a consultation about whether this is a good idea and whether or not we can be partners. Right? We ultimately determine whether I would recommend you to join our practice, and actually I'm really glad that everybody on our team is able to show up. Chani, Zeli, Shuli, Heidi, and Sarah, who's a new member, so we have a whole really grouping of people who are really effective, and ultimately we're going to try to determine whether or not this could be a good partnership. Now, instead of trying to get someone's presenting problems, right? You don't get to come to me if you don't have problems. Otherwise, the entire interview is really not worthwhile, right? The idea is that I want to understand what it's like for you to experience life as you do, right? As opposed to a person being a series of problems, right? You and I and everybody in the room could all be depressed or all struggle with borderline personality disorder, but experience it in our own unique way. And so the idea is, how is it to experience life as you do? When you're depressed or when you're having suicidal thoughts, your thoughts are going to be unique to you. They're going to come out in particular circumstances, right? You hate your mother differently than I hate my mother, right? The idea is that we want to have as strong an understanding as when you hate your mother, what is it like to be you in each of these individual moments across time? So, and I really, by the way, I would encourage everybody to try to ask questions that way, because the feedback I really get is that it's a situation where now they feel like they are being spoken to. Right? I'm interested in you. I'm not interested in your problems. One, I'm not necessarily convinced that what you struggle with is problematic. Right? The idea that it's kind of an assumption that whatever you're going through is inherently a problem, where you actually really might be in a solid position, or at the very least, part of your perspective is incredibly effective. The next idea is that you want to determine whether a person is a good candidate for treatment, right? And the idea of this is really based on the principle that in DBT, and I really do believe in this as a kind of treatment concept, is that it's a relationship of equals, right? There's no such thing as a relationship between client and therapist that is unequal, and I think that's including with a teen, right? The idea is that we're not unequal. My idea is not inherently better than yours, right? You might be smarter than me, right? But the idea is that it's a community of therapists, right? In my team, we have a particular community treating a community of clients, right? And the idea is that we're going to figure out whether we're a good candidate for each other, but just because I've done an intake doesn't mean that you're a good candidate for treatment. And the idea that oftentimes teens come in with the kind of concept of, I'm doing this because my parents want me to do this. And that is usually one of my biggest red flags of, your parents might want you to do this, but they can't tell me what to do. There's no idea that like I have to do something because I'm not your parents' kid, right? They are, all I know is that they've paid for this particular appointment. Beyond that, I can decide, hey, you know what, you really shouldn't pay for further appointments, right? And so the idea is we're going to figure out kind of reciprocally whether we are good candidates for each other's relationship. The next idea is really that you want to show your work, right? Oftentimes people get a recommendation, so many of the people that I work with have, come straight from the hospital. They've made, a very serious suicide attempt or, severe self-injury. But the idea, if I'm recommending DBT, I should always have to show my work, right? There's no such concept or idea that if I have a question, you shouldn't be able to ask why I've asked it, right? If I have a thought, right, you should always be able to understand the background of it. I should always have to show my work, right? It's not like a, math multiple choice question where I'm presented with something and like, oh, you know what, you should do DBT, right? Or you should do CBT, or you should do exposure-based work. You should always have to show your work, and what that does is it really treats the person as an equal. And the idea is that throughout, if you think about a relationship with a teen, you are going to have to spend so much time solving problems together, right? It's all a together collaborative aspect. And as much as you can, if you can kind of absorb the idea that you're a partner, right? You're deciding to partner with somebody. The way that I actually think of, and this is, I think, even the way that you conceptualize your relationship is really important, is that when you're working with a teenager, you are really adopting the role as a therapeutic aunt or uncle, right? If you think about like what an aunt or uncle is, if your kid fails a test, you really consider like, what are all the ramifications of my kids failing or getting kicked out of school or getting thrown out of class, right? When you're an aunt or an uncle, right, you're invested, you care, but you're not going to lose your mind or lose your composure or lose your patience just because your niece or nephew got into some trouble, right? You have a perspective. You have this amazing balance of being able to care, right, but also being able to take a little bit of a step back. And oftentimes with aunts or uncles, and I know this, I have this with my siblings, is that there's an inherent idea of, hey, you know what? This is a situation where your mom or dad actually have to know this, right? They have to be informed. They have to be literate parents, in their relationship with you. And so the idea is if you can adopt a role as a therapeutic aunt or uncle, right, you've already established a relationship that is likely to be collaborative, right? And I think the other idea that comes and dovetails with that is that, this is actually, anybody who works for me is kind of in this boat, is that you want to adopt a mentality and a stance that you take your work seriously, but you don't take yourself seriously. Because teens have a very, very sophisticated nose for someone who's phony, right? So the idea is if you take yourself too seriously, you're also modeling something, right, that would be the exact same relationship they've formed with every other adult, in which this person is an authority that can get me in trouble, whereas the idea of getting you in trouble or having any type of authority, to me, is so preposterous, right? What could I possibly care, right? The idea is that my only role or the only value of me is that I could potentially be helpful. Otherwise, I'm just some guy that's walking around in the street, right? I'm a nobody, right? And that's the idea. You shouldn't take yourself too seriously. And the person should feel that as much as you can. And each of us have different personalities. I tend to be, I guess, fairly irreverent, not because I'm adopting that thing, it's just because that's how I am. I kind of refuse to be different, because to be different would be very tiring for me. So I'm just gonna more or less be this all the way through. And that kind of, again, leads into the last idea, is that you want to get an idea, which is really the most important thing, of whether the person could be a willing participant. A person being extraordinarily suicidal or close to death is a lot less problematic to me if they're incredibly willing. Oftentimes the person who's unwilling ends up being much more challenging than the person who's merely dangerous. Right? If a person's incredibly dangerous but is able to be a partner with you, right, you've already knocked out 80% of the things, because my expectation is you're dangerous. Right? The idea is that that's, in a lot of ways, in a DBT program, that's almost a prerequisite for coming in. Right? So that's a general expectation, but willingness really is not. That's really part of establishing a new type of relationship. Okay, so we always have to have a sheet that looks like this, because otherwise it does not, you're not like Yotze having a DBT conference, so you have to have something that looks like they go against each other, when really, I don't know, it's all more or less the same. But if you were to think about what you'd want to identify in any particular interview, right? On one side, there's typical teen or emerging adult behavior, right? Everyone ought to be doing probably a little bit of drinking, a little bit of smoking, a little bit of hooking up. That's kind of par for the course. And a therapeutic aunt or uncle doesn't lose their mind because, you know, their niece or nephew is doing that, right? So to some extent, and that really also has to do with the philosophy of you, the philosophy of their parents, but a little bit the teen is looking for that type of acceptance. And there is this kind of gray area gvul of what is typical and what is cause for concern, right? And the idea is that you want to kind of be a little bit upfront with that, simply because the truth always wins. If something's a cause for concern, you will be in a problematic situation later. Like, you don't have a choice. Otherwise, what would I possibly care? Because the truth is, I don't really care if you drink a little bit or smoke a little bit, right? I drink a little bit and smoke a little bit. So it's not really one of these things that's inherently a cause for concern, right? Certain things are within one standard deviation of reasonable. The next thing has to do with a person's willingness versus their aggression. And I would say, working with teens, one of the things to get really good at is to get really good at people yelling at you, right? It's an incredible skill. I think about when I was a teenager, how much you care what a 16 or 17-year-old girl thinks of you. Whereas now the idea is completely preposterous. Like, the idea of what could I possibly care what the 17-year-old thinks of me, right? And so the idea of them being aggressive, the main thing is to not take it personal, right? If it's personal, then you end up having to relate with aggressiveness of your own, right? But the idea is it's just there. There's probably a good rationale for why they're being aggressive. Not to necessarily say that they know why. But one of the things to kind of see, and oftentimes you'll see it within an interview itself, is willingness versus aggression. And the thing that I usually like to go for when somebody is notably aggressive is confusion, right? I like the person to kind of be confused, right? To not really have an idea of, almost to be confused at their own aggression, right? It should feel weird to be aggressive to a stranger. That's a strange thing to do. Right? The idea of being aggressive to me, like, you have to meet me for 1 hour, and in 1 hour and 1 minute, the whole game is over, right? Because we're always going to decide whether we're good candidates for each other. The next idea is transparency versus suspicion, and I think that this runs both ways, right? The idea is that you want to try to generate an environment where a teenager can be as transparent, as candid, as forthcoming as humanly possible. And at the same time, it's incredibly fair for them to be suspicious, because oftentimes, it's an adult who's screwed them over. It's an adult who's lied to them. It's an adult who's betrayed their trust, right? And so they might hedge their bets in terms of their level of honesty, right? Sometimes people are transparent to a fault and maybe shouldn't disclose so much. Oftentimes, if a person has, identified or endorsed having a traumatic experience, especially a sexual traumatic experience, what I'll oftentimes say is, listen, it's probably even better for you to tell me the effects of what happened rather than the actual event. Right? If you tell me the event and all the details of it, you might have buyer's remorse and not want to come back, right? Because I'm most interested in terms of, figuring out exactly what happened. That could be fleshed out later. That's a robust thing that you really want to get in a relationship. Here, I'm most interested in, what are the effects on your life? What is it like to experience life like you now as a result of this? And you kind of build that trust of, I'm not actually looking to be a voyeur in your life. Right? I just want to know what it's like to experience life like you. I don't necessarily have to know what it was like for you to experience life in the worst moment of your life in our first interaction. And so the idea, yeah. Oh. By the way, everybody feel free to interrupt, because teenagers do, so please.
In terms of the confusion about aggression, you want to see that the teen is confused about their own aggression, and you want to help them, you want to take them to the place where they can be confused about why they're acting
I think both. I think that one of the ways, almost like the avenue by which you get to it, is to have, I really believe in the value of people feeling weird, right? And another person observing it. It's a very strange thing to do. If you just think about it on its face, right? I'm a complete stranger, right? I've done nothing to you, right? The idea of being aggressive to me should feel weird, right? That should feel like a strange thing to do. And oftentimes I'll say, like, listen, you don't think it's a little bit weird that you're being aggressive to me or hostile to me, right? Like, at any point in time, you can decide to yell at me or leave, right? Those are all options, right? So let's pretend that for the next moment, right, for the next 30 minutes, for the next 40 minutes, we have nothing against each other, right? I haven't screwed you over yet, right? So it's an odd thing to act as if I have, right? And so we're gonna kind of develop this relationship, and we're gonna see based on that whether you're able to do it. Because in a lot of ways, that's a great platform for what our relationship is gonna be like. And what I find oftentimes that the teen kind of, like, you know when a dog is a little bit confused at their owner and they're like this? That's oftentimes the look that you get, right? There's this kind of confused thing, and then almost like through shaping, they begin to be more willing and more engaged in a conversation, right? Because there's a feeling of equality in it, right? Because the only thing that's odd in this conversation is that you're being hostile.
Do they ever feel criticized?
I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure, but the truth is that, I mean, if and you know, everybody who does this treatment and works with people who are challenging, you'd have to do something fairly egregious to not be able to find your way back, right? And so the idea in DBT is that there's a standard kind of movement, speed, and flow, which is a little bit of like a higher concept in the treatment, but the idea is that I can flow in and out of something, and I'm always willing to apologize, right? If I've offended you, right, it's a fair model to kind of honor that and say, hey, listen, my bad, I didn't know that was going to upset you. And we still have to do this, otherwise we're going to burn, you know, your time and your parents' money, right? Which is actually also one of the things that actually comes up a lot in sessions with teens, and my team has heard me speak about this a lot, is that when it comes to like an interview with a teen, right, the idea is that I'm taking your inheritance in this moment and I never give the money back, right? It's your money and now it's my money. There are no backsies, right? Because people will often say like, hey, wait a minute, like, no, it's actually not my money, it's my parents. Who gives a crap? Like, it's your parents now. It was going to be yours. Now it's mine, right? No backsies. Now it's mine forever and ever and ever, right? But the interesting thing is that even if you were to think about that idea, is that, you know, one of the next criticisms is that you're only doing this for the money. And I'm partially doing this for the money, but I don't need Greenbaum money. I'll take Rosenstein money. I don't give a crap. It doesn't make a difference. Your money isn't more green than somebody else's, right? And that kind of establishes a little bit of the equality. The idea is that it becomes very strange to be hostile to me, right? Because it's always honest. Yeah, it's completely true. Part of this is absolutely for the money. It just doesn't have to be yours, right? Again, it establishes the idea of it is now very strange to be aggressive to me, right? Because another person will come in and I'll take their money too. And I could have taken somebody else's in this particular moment, right? So we should probably just do this as equals, and then you can decide whether or not I'm a moron, and you should never see me again, right? That's the nature of the reciprocity. Are we doing on time? Not too bad. All right, in terms of therapist strategies, the idea is, and you know, there's actually value in invalidation. I didn't put it on there because it feels like it'd be against the religion of DBT, but the truth is that when it comes to therapist strategies, you generally want to adopt a validating approach, because if I want to understand what it's like to be you, right, really what it's like to experience life like you, I'm always going to make the assumption that what you're going through makes sense. And if I'm going to make the assumption that what you're going through makes sense, I should adopt a very curious validating approach, right? What validation really is it's not being nice. It's seeking to be understanding. Any asshole can be nice, right? That's not the same thing as being validating, right? I want to understand what it's like to be you, right? If I understand what it's like to be you, I'm very likely to communicate some degree of acceptance. I'm very likely to communicate validation, because it'd be weird not to, right? Then I'm a stiff. And in this type of relationship, you're really trying not to be a stiff. The other idea is to be challenging, right? Some of the presumptions of, you know, when a teen comes in, right, is oftentimes inaccurate. And you have 1 hour, right? 1 hour, oftentimes max, because y'all are busy, right? You have an hour to figure out what you can challenge, to say, hey, listen, you're actually a little bit off on this, right? One of the things I'll often say is that it's totally true that your parents put you in this situation, or at least partly put you in this situation. I'm not willing to agree in most situations that they did it 100%, right? But you definitely didn't cause all of your problems. That's totally fair, right? At the same time, the idea that you have it all together and that without any intervention you're going to make it work is 0%. 0%, right? And if it's not zero, I would bet all the money in my wallet versus all the money in yours, right? It's one of these things where there has to be some level of challenge, otherwise there's no rationale for them being here. And to some degree, they know that there probably is. Whether or not they should stay is its own thing, right? But there's some rationale and some element of their idea or concept or premise probably ought to be challenged. And the idea is that you want to do it as face up as you can. Where that comes to, and probably this seems natural, is that there's a level of reciprocal communication. In DBT, there's one primary, what we call stylistic strategies. And that exists on the spectrum of reciprocal communication and irreverence. And what reciprocal communication is your general modeling, your general mirroring, right? Your general presence and validation and acceptance that you have with the client in front of you. Irreverence is the idea, is almost kind of like the question I asked Sachi in the other session, which I thought he answered beautifully, is the idea of being extraordinarily genuine and not terribly concerned about insulting the person, right? The idea is it's kind of the idea that I'm going to speak to you face up, right? And if you can find the way that you do that naturally, oftentimes it's the way that you would speak to a friend, right? It's the way that you would speak to a family member where you're not overly concerned about their feelings. Because one of the main things that these teens experience is a lot of fragilization, right? People begin to treat them as fragile, not necessarily because they're always afraid of, them breaking, but just because they're afraid of upsetting them, right? The idea is that you don't know where the landmines are, right? But one of the beautiful things is that if a person is going to be dysregulated at almost every turn, you almost have the freedom to trigger them, right? You have the freedom to be straight with them because either way they're going to be upset, and at the very least, they should be upset in a way that actually enhances learning, right? And that's kind of one of your incredible opportunities, but it's a tremendous balance. And depending on who the person is, you might find yourself hedging towards one or the other. Yes, please. By the way, what's your name? It's probably easier if people say their names. I happen to have known Heather's name, so that.
So I'm a little confused about what that really would look like, because as teens, the best of teens are cheeky, right? So then we
Great word.
because it's like a little, it's non-judgmental, and that's what they're supposed to be. And they are challenging boundaries and doing all the things they're supposed to do. And then by the time they get to like their mid-20s, they've gone through whatever they've gone, college, yeshiva, whatever they're doing, then they know how to be without being that, without being cheeky. They have a certain amount of reflection. But here, we're like mirroring back that we can be like, we can offend them, but we don't want to teach them that that's the goal, that at 25 or at 30, you're just offending people. Like, where's the boundary?
It's a great question. I would say it's surgical offending, right? The idea is that when I offend you, right, or when I challenge you, I'm shooting for something, right? I'm shooting for a particular result, right? If I'm going to offend you, I may as well make it worthwhile, right? Because the idea is that I'm offending you with a full heart, right? I'm actually offending you to a certain way out of care, and the goal isn't to offend. The goal is to have the person learn something, right? And oftentimes, the only way for the person to learn something is to put your shoulder through them, right? Everybody's so careful, but oftentimes they go through so much time with no one telling them the truth, right? And so the idea is, I'll recalibrate. It's not meant to be offensive, it's meant to teach, right? The person should learn something from the interaction, right? And again, oftentimes, if you were to think about your best teachers, your best coaches, your most effective parents, whether they were your own or whether they were a friend's, right? It's oftentimes the person who is willing to speak very straight with you, right? They didn't dance around you. They didn't treat you as fragile. They spoke to you straight, right? Even if it was hard, right? Sometimes especially because it was hard. And the thing is that most people internally, if they know it's real, right? Because again, the idea that I would have somebody come in and my goal would be to offend somebody, right? There's not a great rationale for that. I can make fun of my friends, right? Here, it is like, no, I want to make fun of you. I want to be a part of this with you. And if you're struggling with something that might need some type of correction, right, we can be in it together. Sometimes it's the most playful thing you can model, right? Because to a certain extent, you have to be a little bit 16, right? Like I never want to not be 16 at some portion of my being. I want to always be, I probably want to be at least 20% 16 because it's a lot more fun in a lot of ways to live your life as a 16-year-old than a 38-year-old. Right? If a 16-year-old's living their life well, it's amazing. It's so much fun. Right? Oftentimes that's one of the difficulties is that they're not having any fun. Right? So it's the idea of kind of productive offense. And then the next idea has to do with the spectrum between trying to generate commitment and being completely uninvested in the result. Right? The idea of figuring out whether we can build a collaborative relationship, right, is the idea of actually determining whether we can. Right? This doesn't have to end with you being a client. Right? It doesn't have to end that way. Ideally it would, otherwise, again, the rationale for the consultation doesn't make a lot of sense. Right? If I'm doing the consultation in the first place, it means that I have reason to believe that you could be a good candidate for treatment and that we can potentially help you. Right? That your life could be better off from having encountered us. Right? But if a person feels, you know that when you're being sold, there's a general behavioral concept. It really comes from marketing called reactance, which is when a person feels like they're being sold, they naturally try to find a way to not buy. Right? You try to find all the difficulties versus, generally speaking, I'm not trying to sell you. Right? The reasons for engaging in treatment are all of your own. Right? I just might be presenting it in a more organized way. Right? The idea of your life can take potential turns. And there's actually, we'll get into it in a minute, but one of the main commitment strategies in DBT is freedom to choose and absence of alternatives, right? That is built into the consultation from the get-go, is that you absolutely always have the freedom to choose, and it's not a tactic, it's a truth. DBT commitment strategies are not tactics. They're not really tactics to get you to commit, they're tactics to find the truth. Right? We're trying to generate the greatest possibility that you'd be willing to commit, but never force you. Right? If you find yourself forcing, if you find yourself trying to shove a puzzle piece, it means that you're probably a little bit off. Right? You might have to move back a little bit more towards non-investment, but you shouldn't be so non-investment that the person will feel that you won't care about them. Right? Here in a consultation, I'm willing to care about you as much as a person who's met somebody and sees somebody suffering on the side of a highway. Right? We don't owe each other more than that, right? That's how much I owe you because we're going to determine together how much we invest in one another, all right? Any questions before I move on? No? Okay, so commitment strategies, and it's generally not presented this way, but it happens to really fall out that there are different commitment strategies and they happen to nicely fall out on that same spectrum of generating commitment and being a little bit less invested. It happens to be that those arrows are from a different presentation, so they don't necessarily actually have to transact and go back and forth. So for the sake of this, pretend they don't exist. On the change side, right, there are the two first initial commitment strategies, one being foot in the door and the other one being door in the face. I almost always start door in the face, right? Door in the face being the idea of, I want to present a much larger commitment, right? The idea of saying, listen, in order to do this well, right, you're really struggling. In order to do this well, this is a year treatment, minimum, right, minimum. If you're really having problems, this might be a year and change, right? But it's going to be a year thing. And so if you really want to do this solidly, it would be great if you can commit to that amount, right? With the knowledge that that is actually also a really long time. But the reason why I start with door in the face is that I always tell the truth, right? I'm not going to say it won't take a year. It will absolutely take a year in all likelihood, right? And so that's what you should try to commit to. You should try to commit to a year. It happens to be that that might be too difficult. And if you push back, maybe I'll go down to a certain amount. I never go down to a month, ever. I never go down to below 3. Because otherwise you're setting yourself up for a little bit too much failure, right? Because their parent could die in the first month, right? Something terrible can happen, some type of struggle, their friend, breaks up with them, a boyfriend cheats on them, whatever it might be, and then within that first month, they never really get started, right? So I always start door in the face. The other concept is foot in the door, but again, my foot in the door is usually a little bit more substantial. So as opposed to saying like, hey, why don't you start and do your first group and then see if you like it and come in, I will usually start with, 2 modules, right? Maybe one module, right? We have to have some frame of time where you can actually get the experience and decide whether you love it, hate it, or are kind of still curious, right? So foot in the door is the idea of I want to give some type of offer that at least will hook you. But again, I tend to go with door in the face because I really believe it to be more honest. And that should be kind of the feeling that they're always getting. The next idea is shaping, which usually follows up from foot in the door and door in the face, which is generally trying to shape commitment, right? You begin with certain levels of commitment and then you bring it on to others, including sometimes, although I don't love doing this so much, but including the idea of, you know what, why don't we begin a first couple of sessions without this particular part of it? Or maybe, you know, in the first couple of groups, let's see if you could do 3/4 of it, right? I understand that you're probably going to be out for 25 minutes, right? I'm willing to accept that. We have to work at the greater amounts, but we're going to shape towards it. The third idea is activating the client's wise mind. And usually we think of wise mind almost as this acceptance strategy, except for that we know that it's in this weird middle of things. But the idea of activating a client's wise mind is working on the assumption that there is wisdom in the person that you're working with, right? If they were so dumb and stupid, right, then they're not relevant to you as a client, right? It means that they can't learn. But if they are, everyone's been wise at some point, right? And so the idea is trying to figure out, listen, not what's the right or the wrong, but what's the wisest thing that you can do, which is not necessarily believing in me wholesale, but sometimes the wisest thing you can do is give something a shot, right? And if you're going to give it a shot, you should do it full, right? Even that small piece, even if we're doing foot in the door, right, you should put everything in it, right? So that's activating the client's wise mind. The acceptance-based strategies when it comes to trying to generate commitment, and this a little bit has to do with a lesser investment, one is pros and cons, right? And again, pros and cons is kind of a strategy for commitment, but it's not a tactic for commitment, right? It's a tactic for finding the truth. We should determine what are the true pros and cons of participating in this treatment. Oftentimes, even if you were to think about when a person's worried, right? If you were to think about when a person is worried and they're anxious and they're thinking about the worst consequences, oftentimes they have no idea what it actually is, right? We do these downward arrow techniques to try to find what that terrible feared consequence is, right? Oftentimes they don't actually know the true logistical pros and cons about why they do or don't want to do anything. So here you can actually be a participant in helping them discover exactly why you wouldn't want to do treatment. In fact, one of the things I ask people is, how come you're alive, right? Truly, why are you not dead? Why are you not in a hospital? It's not unreasonable, right? It would make sense, right? And so there are true cons for staying alive. There are true cons for doing this treatment, right? One, if I were to even think about myself, and thank God the people on my team are a little bit different than me, is that one of the values of doing this treatment is that you can get better if you work really hard, right? One of the downsides is that I am extraordinarily demanding, right? And the reason why I'm extraordinarily demanding is that I know what it takes, right? If your life sucks this bad, right, that means what you're going up against is vicious. And you will need somebody, in my opinion, that's equally vicious, right? That viciousness will come from an investment, from a true care and love in my own weird Shamshy way, right? And everybody's kind of got their own way of doing that, right? But that's a real con, is that I will be tough, right? I'll hopefully be loving also, but sometimes you really do need somebody that's a little bit tougher than your problem. So that's the pros and cons.
Could you give an example of that?
So what do you mean?
Of tough, being tough. What kind of situation? How tough would you be?
So, one, I think you can, if you haven't felt it a little bit, right, that's a little bit part of the demeanor. But the thing is that I will, if I think that there's something that has to happen, I want to understand it and validate as much as possible, and also say, now it's not a question of whether it happens. This is absolutely happening. Maybe it doesn't happen now. Maybe it happens in our next session, but there's only so long I'm willing to be patient with your problem. Because otherwise it's going to get worse. That becomes therapy interfering, right? It's going to get in the way of your treatment, and it's going to annoy me, right? It's not good for me to be annoyed. I'm going to be less patient with you, right? You don't want me to be demoralized. It's not good for me to be demoralized, right? I would say also it has to do with what I believe is a teen's responsibility, right? One of the things, oftentimes there's a kind of a follow-up with the teen and their parent. And what I say to teenagers and I say to their parents is, at the age of 15, it is absolutely your responsibility to make it as easy as possible for your parent to parent you. right? You can rebel a little bit, you can mess up, right? You can come late sometimes, but it is your responsibility to make it possible for your parent to parent you. Otherwise, your ability to complain gets a lot lower because you're being impossible, right? You should make it as easy as possible for me to do my job. If you're not, we got a problem, right? And that's kind of the idea of not only speaking straight, but that means I demand a little bit of that movement because I get you for so little time, right? There's so much more time you can screw up your life than I can help you.
The door in the face approach sounds like you're relying on the teen to be able to fight you back when you're saying 12 months and they say they want 9 months. When you're relying on the fact
Yeah.
that the parents are healthy enough parents to parent them, how does it all work out?
So in terms of the door in the face and relying on the fact that they'd agree is, one, if they agree, that's incredible, right? So if they agree, I take their agreement. But the truth is I question it, right? Which I'll get to the next particular strategy. But if they agree to 12 months, hey, we're in business. I actually want to know why. I'm so curious as why would you agree to 12 months with me, right? That's like an interesting thing, right? With the parents, right? Oftentimes what you're really doing is you're showing your work for why I actually think your kid will invest the time, right? I really want to know why will this kid invest the time, right? And do 12 months of a demanding, difficult treatment, right? So if they're willing to do it, hey, listen, that's incredible. It makes everyone's job a lot less. Because sometimes they're actually intrigued and oftentimes they really know that they need it. Oftentimes they weren't presented with a model that will actually work for them, right? Usually what happens is they've met a really nice, generally effective therapist that isn't, not that they can't necessarily do it, but isn't offering a model that can effectively treat their problem, right? It's not necessarily because every individual therapist is so amazing. There's so many skilled therapists. It's just that anything less than true comprehensive DBT is unlikely to work because it doesn't have the things in place to do it. So the next one is devil's advocate, right? Devil's advocate is, right, again, it's kind of based on that question of why are you alive, right? Why would you want to do this treatment, right? It's difficult, it's hard, right? And oftentimes it's like one of these things where everyone thinks it's reverse psychology of like, oh, you shouldn't want to do this thing. And then the person says, oh my God, of course I want to do it. But what it really is it's true to form, right? There are true cons to doing this treatment. And the idea is, why would you want to do this, right? It means that you're going to have to handle a tremendous period of time of distress, right? You're going to have to really want to cut and find a way to not do it, even though you're so attached to it, right? Even though you really want to die, even though you think your parents are schmucks, right? We're going to have to find a way to resolve that, and you're going to have to be willing. So why would you want to do it? It's a very acceptance-based strategy. Hopefully the idea is that it ends up moving them. And the last one is the one we've kind of referenced beforehand, which is inherently acceptance-based, which is that you have the freedom to choose, and you might recognize that there are an absence of alternatives, which might bring you back to, actually these arrows do go together, of activating the client's wise mind, right? The idea is that when you realize that there's a wise stance and place in that, right? You have the freedom to choose. You can do whatever you want. You can absolutely not do this and I'll never chase you, right? But there might be an absence of alternatives because you don't have another way, another model of getting better. Okay, so common questions is, how is this going to help me? Just doing this for the money, which I've already addressed, and why do you care, right? And the answer for why do I care, oftentimes, listen, DBT is actually, in a lot of ways, it's a treatment of self-disclosure, right? Because again, if it's going to be a reciprocal relationship, if it's going to be a relationship of equals, I should have to answer for myself, right? You should have to answer the question of why would you care, right? And so the truth is I have a particular answer, right? And one, feel free to plagiarize mine. You can say, I heard this story from some guy, right? But oftentimes, if you can find your own, they'll feel it. So the way that I think about this particular problem of why do you care, and I haven't found a situation where the person hasn't related to it, not because they relate to me, but in my belief, the story is undeniable. So when my grandfather was liberated from the concentration camps, right, he described the idea of being hefker. I'm ownerless. Nobody would ever know if I lived or died. Right? He said, like, it wasn't just that my whole family was dead. Every person I had ever met on planet Earth was dead. I knew no people, right? And so if I walked off into the ocean, no one would ever know, right? Who cares? And so he had this idea of like, you know what? you know, I guess I could kill myself. He's like, yeah, people in our generation didn't do that so much, or I hadn't heard of it, right? But you know, eventually you get to this point where you can come to your own ideas, right? And I thought about killing myself, and then I had the idea, you know what? I can always do that later. Let's see how things play out, right? We'll see how things play out. Maybe something interesting will happen, because I can always just do or die, right? And because he did that, I don't think that the family and the children and great-grandchildren, et cetera, are a replacement for that family, right? The idea is that in a lot of ways, his life remained extraordinarily painful, because who can lose your whole family and not live a life of pain? It's an unfair thing. That's the true dialectic. But what he ultimately did is he created a life that was apparently worth enough meaning to stay alive and to keep playing games, right? And the idea is that it's almost, I truly believe it's undeniable that you want to compare suffering, it's not really all that worthwhile, but we could all agree that that's a level of suffering and hopelessness and demoralization, right? That it's probably equal enough to yours, right? And if a person was able to generate a life that was worth meaning and compelling, right, then there might be one that you have also, and I'm interested, right? People go on to do extraordinary things. Who knows what you're capable of? You might be an amazing musician already, or there might be some dormant skill that you haven't yet discovered, right? And so the idea is to learn to be imaginative, right? Oftentimes 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds can be incredibly imaginative, but also very dull-minded, right? Depression and hopelessness and demoralization really tightens your world and tightens your imagination. And so the idea is to expand it, not because I know what should be, but because I'm interested. I'll end it even with this second story. My daughter came to me 2 years ago. It was like around Yom Ha'atzmaut, and she said, "Oh, Abba, it's so amazing that we made Aliyah. I think when I grow up, I want to do that also." And I'm like, one, we don't run that experiment back again. That's an insane thing to do, because it didn't necessarily have to work out. But then I said, that's actually not your thing, right? That's already been done, right? That was my project, right? That was mine and Mommy's project, right? And she said, what's going to be my project? Like, what am I meant to do? And I said, I don't know, we'll figure it out. Truth is, you'll figure it out, right? Hopefully you'll adopt some of the values, assuming mine are good, or maybe if they're not, you'll find out some other ones that are pretty good. Hopefully I'm doing something right? But the idea is that I have no idea what the world, I mean, listen, you see with your own kids, right? As if you compare your kid for the job of the future, as if we have any idea what that's going to be. But I'm interested. Who knows what you're going to discover? Who knows what you're going to be interested in? Right? And that's kind of the same thing, and it creates a general reciprocity, because it means that I believe that you're interesting even though you might not yet be. Right? You might not be interesting. You might be extraordinarily boring. Right? But I'm willing to invest in imagining something cool with your life, and I don't have to know what it is, which I think also models the idea of it's okay to be uncertain. So much depression and anxiety and hopelessness comes from the idea of I don't know how it's going to turn out. But the thing is, neither do I, and I'm cool with it, right? The idea is that we can kind of be cool with it together, right? We can figure this out together, and so it remains reciprocal, it remains true. What I was going to do if we had more time, originally these were slotted to be like 2-hour things, was just to have people, you know, come up and be their most annoying teenage client, and then just have me respond, because it's more fun and it takes less preparation. But, you know, feel free to do that with me during the break, just because, you know, why not? And also, I haven't been yelled at for a while, so it's, you know, or like kind of like, you know, stoned out where like nobody talks to you. But if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts, please. I was that comprehensive. That's incredible. Unbelievable. Thank you guys, and have a good rest of the conference.